Carolyn Killaby went out one night to clear her head and was last seen walking across a parking lot. The police soon zeroed in on a suspect, but when he realized it, he took off. They now had to build a case while chasing a fugitive. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines and the first episode of 2024. As you can probably tell, I didn't manage to get the Q&A and the updates episode done during my break, but I am still hoping to release one probably in February. So if you have any questions, you can still email those to me at crimelinespodcast@gmail.com. They can be anything related to the podcast or me or podcasting in general, cases you're interested in, that sort of thing. Also, just to make a quick announcement about something new I'm doing this year, we'll see how long I keep it up. I'm not very good about maintaining my website with the cases I cover, but I wanted to try something new this year. I wanted the entries to be something useful to people who just come across the website looking for information on a case, or people who listened to the podcast. I wanted it to be an added value rather than just a place where I'm promoting my podcast. After mulling over a few ideas, I landed on what I think is the most logical option here. This is Crimelines, after all, where we follow the timeline of a case. So wouldn't it make sense to then post the timeline on the website for each case? So if you listen through each episode and you need the visual to put it all together with whatever pictures I can find, they will be posted hopefully each week. I have done some time blocking on my schedule at my husband's suggestion, and I made sure I built in time to create and format the timeline and get it posted. So I really hope this isn't something that falls by the wayside. I don't think it will because I'm a lot better with purpose-driven projects and tasks rather than promotional ones or the idea that I should have a website because I'm supposed to have a website. Those types of things I don't stick to. But this seems to have a purpose and a usefulness, so I'm much more likely to do it. Today's case will be the first one with a timeline on the website. To give credit where credit is due, I first heard about this case on Forensic Files, and this is one where cutting-edge technology did solve the case. For some balance, though, next week's case happens to be one with pretty much no forensic evidence, and it's really interesting how much sure I am that they got the right guy when there is both circumstantial and direct evidence. Let's go ahead and get started with Carolyn Killaby. She was born in October of 1961, the youngest of 5 kids born to her mother, Nancy. Growing up, she called Delmar Lieb Dad, though he was not her biological father. But he had so fully stepped into that role that Carolyn never knew. Carolyn was almost nearly a lifelong Oregon resident. She was born and raised in Portland until she was around 9. The family then moved an hour south to the Salem area, and it was there that Carolyn met her first husband, and the two moved back to Portland. Together, they had one daughter, but the marriage ended in divorce. In 1990, Carolyn married for the second time to Dan Killaby, someone who she had dated for a few years at that point. Dan also had a daughter from a previous marriage, and the two blended the family with Carolyn at the helm. She was organized and fun and was everyone's cheerleader. Having entered her stepdaughter's life when she was little, only about 4 years old, Carolyn had a strong parenting role in her life, and they were very close. Dan worked as a manager at a furniture refinishing business in Vancouver, Washington, while Carolyn worked for the military. She was a civilian medical technician at the processing exam station in Portland. She had worked there for about a decade and was well-respected and very responsible. The family eventually moved just over the state line to Vancouver, Washington, and this was her first time living outside of Oregon, and even then she was just 9 miles over the border. Dan and Carolyn were described as being like newlyweds for the first few years of their marriage, but things had been strained in 1995. According to some of Carolyn's friends, she had brought up the topic of divorce, though she wasn't to where she was ready to separate just yet. It was more like she could see it as a possible path, but it wasn't one she wanted to be on. That's why she was actively working on things with Dan. On Saturday, November 11th, 1995, both of their daughters were going to be away for the night, so they decided ahead of time to spend the night together, reconnecting after a few days of arguing and bickering. A little romance to start smoothing things over and remember how much they loved each other. On that day, Dan was leaving work when his brother asked him if he wanted to go grab a drink. Dan knew he had to get home to Carolyn for their romantic date night, but he figured he could go hang out with his brother for a little while and then still be home in time to spend time with Carolyn. So Dan went and had a drink. And then he had another drink. And then the game was on. And, well, Dan didn't make it home in time. From what I gather, this sort of thing was one of the things they would argue about. 34-year-old Carolyn was upset and hurt when her husband didn't show. She decided she was not going to sit around at home stewing and feeling bad for herself, but rather she was going to go out, have some fun, and hopefully clear her head. She headed out to Omar's Steakhouse and Lounge, which was in Orchards, Washington, on the outskirts of Vancouver. It was not her first time there. She had gone a few times since they moved to the area earlier that year, seeing as it was just 10 minutes from their house. The lounge part of Omar's Steakhouse and Lounge was a night spot with music and dancing. Carolyn did dance with a few guys that night and had a few rather strong drinks. In one article, it said she was drinking scotch. Carolyn was not a big drinker usually, and she was also thin. She only weighed 110 pounds while she was standing 5'6". So it didn't take much for her to get very intoxicated. Add to that, Carolyn had been in a car crash years before, and she had chronic pain. She was taking Vicodin for that pain, so it's possible the pain medication interacted poorly with the alcohol in a way she didn't expect. Whatever the reason, Carolyn became very intoxicated according to witnesses. She was eventually sitting at the table with her head down. In the meantime, Dan had also had too much to drink that night with his brother, and he called Carolyn around 1 a.m. to let her know that he wouldn't be home until the morning. He was going to sleep at his brother's house since he really couldn't drive. Carolyn didn't answer the phone, which he didn't really expect her to at that time of night, so he left a message on the machine and fell asleep. On Sunday morning, Dan returned home and noticed that Carolyn and her car were not there. He assumed she was angry at him for having disappeared on her the night before, so he just waited for her to come home. But that night, he started to get worried when he didn't hear from her. Carolyn may have gone out to get away from him for the day, but she never stayed out of touch for long. If she was anywhere, she was probably with a family member or a friend, so Dan called around trying to figure out whose house she was laying low at. But everyone had the same answer. They hadn't seen or heard from Carolyn all day. Dan went to bed that night worried, but I'm sure he was still trying to tell himself that she just must be really angry to stay out like that. But he knew something was wrong for sure the next morning. Carolyn was expected to report to work at 6 a.m. on Monday. She didn't come home to get ready, and then she didn't show up to work or call out. Dan and his brother decided to drive around Vancouver to look for her. They eventually found Carolyn's car parked at Omar's. The car looked as though it had been parked, and Carolyn simply walked away from it. There was nothing obviously wrong. There was a handwritten note found in the car indicating a flight number from Portland to Los Angeles. And while it would have been wildly out of character for Carolyn to just up and leave her family like that, it had to be considered. But it was very quickly found to be unrelated to Carolyn's disappearance. It was from a week before when she gave her daughter's friend a ride to the airport as a favor. It was an early lead that was quickly dismissed, and I wouldn't really be bringing it up, except I see that it's still getting mentioned in reporting to this day. The family at this point was really considering every option aside from Carolyn being dead to explain why she dropped out of touch with everyone. The flight to LA was one hope that was dashed. Dan told the Columbian newspaper that he thought maybe Carolyn had checked herself into rehab over her Vicodin use, and she wasn't allowed to use the phone while she was there. Now, it didn't make sense that no one told the family she was there. She didn't tell them ahead of time. She didn't pack anything. But they were really grasping at straws because the truth was Carolyn would never have left her daughters like that, even if she was angry at Dan. But they had to hold on to hope. After finding the car and no trace of Carolyn, Dan called the police and reported his wife missing. In speaking with the employees at Omar's, the investigators learned that Carolyn had last been seen there on Saturday night, and she had gotten very drunk. So much so that when another regular customer, 33-year-old Dennis Smith, walked her out to her car around 11:30, he had to help her walk. Though Dennis was a regular and Carolyn had been to Omar's previously, they had never met before that night. Dennis seemed concerned about her in general when he saw her dancing with various men, warning the bouncer that she might be trouble because she might cause a fight. And then when she was very drunk, he seemed concerned about getting her home safely. When Dennis and Carolyn left the bar, Carolyn left her purse behind, so a bouncer ran it out to her in the parking lot. He told the police that Carolyn was almost limp at this point and wouldn't have been upright without Dennis's help. Obviously, the police wanted to talk to Dennis because he was the last one to see her, and seeing as her car was still in the parking lot, they knew Carolyn didn't drive herself away from the restaurant. Dennis would be the only person who would know how she left. And Dennis, he had a strange story for the police about this. And strange stories are always going to raise suspicion. Dennis said that he and Carolyn had gotten out to the parking lot and they were near his truck when a man rushed them. This man was holding a club and hit Dennis while yelling, "You bitch," at Carolyn. Though Dennis managed to get a punch in during the scuffle, the man dragged Carolyn off. Not wanting to get involved in whatever situation was going on, Dennis said he just got in his truck and left. This story seemed odd, but Carolyn was out dancing and then looked like she was leaving the bar with a man. So what if Dan Killaby had come across her in the parking lot that night? Possibly he would have been angry or jealous at what he saw. And Dan is, well, the husband, and he admitted that he and Carolyn had been fighting recently. He was also the primary beneficiary of $230,000 in life insurance, plus Carolyn's retirement benefits. His alibi for the night was that he was drinking in a bar and then he was at his brother's house. A bartender was able to back up half of that alibi and his brother backed up the other half, though relatives lie for each other all the time, so this could not be considered fully confirmed. During searches of the area around Omar's, a search dog led from the restaurant to Carolyn's house, making the police wonder if she did, in fact, make it home that night. But once at the house, they didn't find any evidence that anything had happened there. A search dog did indicate on Dan's vehicle, but a search of that vehicle also found nothing. Dan was polygraphed twice, and he passed both times, and it seems this time the police took the polygraphs fairly seriously in this investigation. And that might be because they were also looking into Dennis Smith and his odd story as another possible lead. Dan himself had his own suspicions of this man, Dennis, thanks to Dennis's own nephew, Dustin. Dustin had read a newspaper article about Carolyn's disappearance, which was on the front page, and noticed that she was last seen at Omar's with a man named Dennis. No last name was given in the article, which I can confirm through the newspaper archives. He was simply called Dennis in the early reporting. Dustin knew his uncle Dennis was a regular at Omar's, and he wondered if he could be the same guy. So he looked up Dan Killaby's phone number, calling to explain what he saw in the paper, and asked if the police had told Dan what Dennis's last name was. Dan said no, they hadn't, but he was curious to hear more about why Dustin was calling. Dustin explained who his uncle was and said that if this was Dennis Smith, Dan needed to know that he had a violent past. He had murdered Dustin's mother, his own sister, 29-year-old Patricia Johnson. We need to back up to 1982. On June 27th, Dustin's father, Dwight, drove him home after a weekend visit when Dustin was just 5 years old. When they got there around 3 p.m., Patricia wasn't home, so Dwight left Dustin with a neighbor to babysit, assuming Patricia would be back soon. She was probably just at work, and that would put her home around 6. When Patricia didn't return, the neighbor called Patricia's parents to see what was going on. They came and picked Dustin up, though they had no idea what was happening. They learned that Patricia had not shown up for her Sunday morning shift, and no one had seen or heard from her since the day before. So they went ahead and reported Patricia missing. That same day, a 17-year-old looking for a fishing hole near Salmon Creek in Vancouver found Patricia's license and credit card. He assumed she had just lost them, so he tried to call Patricia's home phone that day, but he didn't get any answer. When he called the following day, her sister and an officer answered the phone because they were there searching for clues. The discovery of these personal items gave the authorities a starting place for their search. They found Patricia's purse, as well as pantyhose and a plaid blouse stuck on some branches. Divers went into the creek, but nothing more was found. On July 2nd, Patricia's car was found 4 hours away in Bellingham on a gravel road. She did have some relatives in the area, but they had not seen her. 4 days later, in the early evening of July 6th, Patricia's ex-husband Dwight went to the newspaper office to ask about getting more coverage on Patricia's case. He did a quick interview, and then he decided to head out to search again. He had been a pretty big part of the efforts to find Patricia. He decided to go back to the one sure point on the map, Salmon Creek, where her belongings were found. During his search, under a bush, he found Patricia's nude body. Dwight later expressed upset that other searchers hadn't found her body, as it was an area that had been searched already. In fact, her body was just 30 meters from where her license and other items were found. Due to how concealed it was with the bush, the bramble, and some ferns, it seems like they probably just walked right by it. It is not spelled out in the reporting exactly how the police started to suspect Patricia's brother, 20-year-old Dennis Smith. Logic would say that they were looking at a family member since, 1, most people who are murdered are killed by someone they know, and 2, her car was found 4 hours away near where some family members lived. I wonder if a family member maybe mentioned that Dennis had been up there visiting on some random day. Dennis also placed himself at Patricia's home around the time she went missing, though I'm not sure if he did this before or after the police came to suspect him. If it was before, obviously, this would make them take a hard look at him. Dennis claimed that while he was at his sister's home at some point around the time she went missing, he saw a strange man leave, pushing him aside and running off. At first, Dennis stuck to this story even as the police interrogated him, but he eventually confessed that he and Patricia had gotten into an argument, supposedly over him using her car without permission. If she reported that he had taken her car, he would end up in quite a bit of trouble since he was, at the time, on parole. In December of 1980, he had been convicted of possession of stolen property and bail jumping. He had only been released in March of 1982, 3 months before Patricia was killed. Initially charged with first-degree murder for killing his sister and theft for taking her car, Dennis took a plea deal for second-degree murder. He ended up spending just 10 years in prison, being paroled in June of 1993. After failing a drug test, Dennis was sent back to jail from December of 94 until March of 95. He was then free for 8 months when Carolyn went missing. When Dennis was first paroled, he moved in with his wife, who he had married while behind bars. By the time Carolyn went missing, they had separated, and he was living home with his parents. Dustin, Patricia's son, was also living with his grandparents at the time. Dustin had been told by his grandparents that his Uncle Dennis was in prison due to an accident. But he had doubts about the family's assertion that his mom died by accident. He was not comfortable around his uncle, so when he saw that a man named Dennis was the last person seen with a missing woman, he decided to pick up the phone and call Dan Killaby. When Dan hung up with Dustin, he called the lead investigator on Carolyn's case. He said that he had gotten a call about the man Carolyn was last seen with and asked if his last name was Smith. He told Unsolved Mysteries that there was a long pause on the other end, and he realized that it was, in fact, Dennis Smith. The detectives told him that they were aware of Dennis's record and were already investigating him. The police had sat down with Dennis on November 14th to question him. Dennis's full story, which had not been publicized up to that point, was that when he and Carolyn got out into the parking lot, they both got into his truck and they were in there for 45 minutes. He claimed that they had sex and he claimed it was consensual, in spite of the fact that Carolyn could barely walk at that point. Dennis said it was after they had sex that a man came up to the truck with a club, attacked him, and pulled Carolyn away. When later shown a photo lineup that included Dan Killaby, Dennis pointed Dan out, saying that he looked like the man who attacked him. There were things in this interview that did not add up for the investigators. For one, Dennis's story changed over the course of the interview. It wasn't in any major ways, more like confusion over who said what and who did what that night, but there were more changes than you would normally hear in a single conversation. If these details changed over the course of 3 interviews, it would make sense. But when he mixed up details just 5 or 10 minutes after telling the story, it sounded like he was making up some of it as he went. Another red flag was that Dennis said he had first heard about Carolyn's disappearance on Sunday, November 12th, the day after she went missing. But that would have been impossible since no one heard of her disappearance by then. At that point, even Dan thought she was just staying away from home because she was angry with him. But it wasn't just this interview or his criminal record that made investigators take a harder look at Dennis. It was also the witness statements. At 11:52 on the night Carolyn disappeared, someone called 911 saying they heard a woman screaming for help from a field in a housing development just north of Omar's. There was a second call at 11:57 from someone else reporting that they had heard the same thing. The police did respond to these calls, but they didn't find anything. In retrospect, the investigators believe these screams were likely from Carolyn, but according to Dennis's timeline, the two of them would have still been in his truck in the parking lot. About an hour and a half after these screams at 1:30 in the morning, Dennis went to a 7-Eleven convenience store in Orchards. The clerk told the police that there was a blood smear on the right side of his dress shirt and his hand was wrapped up. Dennis explained both of these by saying he had been in a fight at the bar. Dennis would tell the police that the blood on his shirt was his and it was from the attack from the strange man in the parking lot, but he conveniently didn't have the shirt to turn over, so they couldn't test it. His bloody shirt from that night had disappeared. Believing Dennis was likely their guy, the investigators went out to where he worked on November 15th and looked inside his truck to see what they could see in plain sight. Inside the front cab, on the bench seat, there was major damage. The middle part of the seat had been burned right down to the metal cushion springs. The damage definitely happened after Carolyn went missing, according to witnesses. Dennis had gone to a special dinner that Omar's was hosting on Sunday, the day after Carolyn disappeared. Rather than being told about her disappearance like he claimed, it was Dennis who told someone else about how this man had attacked him after he had sex with Carolyn in his truck and then dragged Carolyn off. This person thought the story was as weird as everyone else did, so when he was in the parking lot after dinner, he peeked in Dennis's truck out of curiosity. Nothing in there looked odd. There certainly wasn't a burned-out seat. When asked about the damage, Dennis said it was caused when a cigarette fell onto the seat. But the amount of damage seemed very unlikely to be from a burning cigarette. Like I said, it was burned clear down to the metal, and it was about 2/3 of the seat that had been destroyed. The investigators asked if they could do a full examination on his truck, and Dennis agreed to turn it over the next day. When he did, the crime scene techs noted that the carpet had been pulled out. It had been intact when they saw the truck the day before. At some point, another witness came forward and said that Dennis had come over to her house between when he spoke with the police and when he turned over his truck. She said the truck's carpet was missing at that time, and Dennis asked her if she thought cleaning products like Lysol would destroy DNA. From another witness, the investigators then learned that Dennis went to a gas station where a friend of his worked and asked her if he could wash his car at her parents' house. He wanted to do this before he turned the truck over to the police because he didn't want them to know that he had been, quote, off-roading. So clearly Dennis had been trying to scrub his truck prior to turning it over, but they were going to do a full forensic search and hope that he missed a few spots. They focused on cracks that were hard to clean, and this paid off. Swabs from a crevice on the steering wheel and a door handle tested positive for blood. They also conducted experiments on a similar seat with cigarettes to see if the damage could have even happened the way Dennis said. No matter what they did or how long they left the burning cigarette on the seat, they could just not get the seat to be consumed by fire. Testing showed the presence of hydrocarbons, which indicates the likelihood an accelerant was used. Testing for hydrocarbons is one of the arson investigation tools that has actually proven not to be total junk science, though there is a degree of interpretation there. I've been looking over a few wrongful conviction arson cases over the last few months, and I may cover one in the future, because I really do want to look at not just what is junk science, but how do we get junk science admissible in court. And it seems like arson investigations are kind of the low-hanging fruit here. But that'll be another case for another day. Let's get back to this one. The crime scene techs had found 2 samples of blood in the truck, and they also had another sample from Dennis's watch. When Dennis could not produce his clothing from the night Carolyn disappeared, the investigator asked for his watch instead, rightfully assuming that he wouldn't have thought about throwing that away, especially if there wasn't obvious blood on it. The swabs were sent to the lab for DNA testing, which ended up not being as straightforward as they would have hoped. While they didn't have Carolyn's DNA, both of her parents, at least her parents of record, were alive. But her mother then had to tell the police something she had never even told Carolyn, and that was that the only man Carolyn ever thought of as dad was not her biological father, and her biological father was dead. Today, the testing would not have been as difficult, but this was the mid-90s, so the testing would take time, and Dennis Smith was not going to stick around for the results. In late November 1995, about 2 weeks after Carolyn disappeared, Dennis showed up at his parole officer's office and saw that there were homicide investigators waiting in the hallway. Not sure if they were there to question him or arrest him, Dennis took off, literally running out of the building. When he did not report to his parole officer and it was clear he fled the area, a warrant was issued for his arrest for the parole violation, and he was declared a fugitive. While Dennis was on the run in June of 1996, the family held a memorial service for Carolyn. They knew Carolyn was not going to be found alive, and they wanted that moment to remember her together. They purchased a plot and a headstone ready for her should her body ever be found. It was a month later, in July of 1996, that the DNA testing was finished. They had used a letter Carolyn mailed to a friend in Alaska to get a DNA profile from the stamp and the envelope flap that she had licked. It was an older letter from the mid-1980s, so the DNA had degraded too much to do a direct match. However, they were able to pull the mitochondrial DNA. This was relatively new technology in 1995 and had never been used in a criminal trial in Washington state up to this point. Mitochondrial DNA is passed through the maternal line. So they used the mitochondrial DNA from the letter, plus from Carolyn's mother, plus from her daughter, and then they confirmed all of that against the DNA from the blood spots. The blood on the steering wheel and the watch were a match. But this was not a 1 in a billion match, it was a 1 in 200,000 match. However, with all the other evidence, they believed they had enough to take this to trial. On July 12, 1996, a warrant was issued for Dennis Smith's arrest for the murder of Carolyn Killaby. Investigators believed that Dennis got Carolyn into his truck by telling her that he was going to take her home. Too intoxicated to really make a decision one way or the other, she got into or was forced into his vehicle. They believe he drove to the nearby field where a woman was heard screaming and raped and murdered Carolyn. He later claimed they had consensual sex to explain away any evidence found in his truck. But then, when faced with the police actually processing his vehicle, Dennis panicked and decided to try to eliminate all of the traces by cleaning the truck, setting the seat on fire, and removing fabric surfaces. His efforts to eliminate all of the forensic evidence didn't work, and the state was sure they could prove it in court as soon as they could figure out where in the world Dennis Smith had gone. They exhausted all leads in Washington, where he had a lot of family, so they turned to national television. A segment aired on Unsolved Mysteries on January 31st, 1997, 14 months after Dennis ran away from the parole officer. The show would lead to his arrest, but not directly. 500 tips came in from all over the country, so the authorities had their hands full following up on all of them. A tip did come in from Florida, but that was just one sighting on what was a very long list of possible sightings that the investigators were making their way through. Dennis was, in fact, in Florida, going by the name David Sanborn. And on January 31st, 1997, he sat down with some friends to watch Unsolved Mysteries. As they were watching, the segment on Carolyn's murder came on, and Dennis suggested they change the channel. One of his friends really wanted to watch the show, so she said no. When they aired the photo of the fugitive Dennis Smith, his friends joked with Dan Sanborn that he kind of looked like the guy. He got upset about it, saying that he was worried someone would call him in as a tip. He told them he was not Dennis Smith, but he was wanted for skipping out on child support in Michigan. So getting on the police radar was not something he welcomed. When Dan left his friend's house that night, he asked if he could borrow their car, and they said yes. When he didn't return it by the next day, they had to call the police and report the car stolen. The car was spotted by the police 3 days later, but it sped off and they couldn't catch up. The next day, on Tuesday, February 4th, the stolen car was spotted again in a shopping center in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, around 7:30 at night. This time, they did get Dennis to step out of the car, and he talked to the officers briefly before taking off running. The cops chased him down and caught him, but he managed to get the flashlight from one of the officers, and he started swinging it, trying to hit them. He then reached for the gun of one of the officers, and the other one pulled out his own weapon and fired, hitting Dennis in the neck. Dennis was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and he underwent surgery. While in the hospital and under arrest for car theft, the police fingerprinted Dennis and uploaded his prints into a database. They came back as a hit to Dennis Smith, who had a warrant for murder. They notified Washington authorities that they had their man in custody. So you can see how Unsolved Mysteries solved the case even though it wasn't through a tip. The airing of the segment put pressure on Dennis, and that led to the chain of events that did end in his arrest. After Dennis recovered enough from being shot, he was sent back to Washington. There, the state made him an offer. Dennis was being charged with first-degree murder, but they would let him plead guilty to second-degree murder on the condition he led them to Carolyn's body. Through his attorney, this offer was turned down. After that, the state upgraded the charges from first-degree murder to aggravated first-degree, which the defense said was retaliation for not taking the deal. The prosecutor said it was actually because they reviewed their case and believed they could prove the necessary aggravating factor, that Carolyn was raped. The difference here between aggravated first-degree murder and first-degree murder would be the sentence. An aggravated first-degree murder conviction would mean the death penalty if the state pursued it, or life in prison with no chance of parole if they didn't. And in this case, they were not seeking a death sentence. When the case went to trial in the spring of 1998, it did so without Carolyn's body, but with the DNA evidence, which the defense tried to argue wasn't conclusive. This was the first trial in the state to use mitochondrial DNA evidence, so I imagine both sides were working very hard to just learn what this evidence meant and to present it to the jury in the light most favorable to their side. The state did have an early pretrial win when they were allowed to bring up the 1982 murder of Patricia Johnson. At first, the judge was like, nope, too prejudicial. But on reconsideration, it was allowed in because it showed similar elements, particularly how Dennis said he saw a man run out of his sister's home, and that man assaulted him, and that was a similar story to what he told about the mystery man in the parking lot. And he gave the same general description for both men. The defense stuck with Dennis's story of consensual sex in the truck, followed by a man charging them and dragging Carolyn off. And they said that man was Dan Killaby, pointing out that Dennis Smith chose him out of a photo lineup in spite of having never met him before. The state countered that Dennis didn't do the lineup until after Dan had already been on the news repeatedly, raising awareness for his missing wife. Dennis very well could have recognized him from TV. The jury took the case and deliberated for 3.5 hours. On May 12, 1998, they found 36-year-old Dennis Smith guilty of aggravated first-degree murder and first-degree murder. This meant an automatic life without parole sentence. In September of that same year, there was a hearing to revoke his parole in the case of Patricia Johnson's murder. The violations were everything from fleeing to Florida to the various things that happened in a scuffle with the police there, and obviously murdering Carolyn Killaby. Of 7 violations charged, he was only found not guilty of one of them, and that had to do with possessing a firearm. It was unclear if he ever got control of the officer's gun in the incident, even though it wasn't for lack of trying. Dennis was given an additional 99 years behind bars. The parole board was clear that they wanted the sentence long enough that even if his conviction in Carolyn's case got overturned, he would never get out of prison. And his conviction was overturned. Well, one of them. In 2001, an appellate court found that there was not enough evidence to support the aggravating factor in the case. That factor was rape, but without a body or any other evidence of sexual assault, they didn't prove it because they couldn't. Dennis could only then be sentenced for regular first-degree murder. So there was a new sentencing hearing that was held on April 20th, 2001. It looked like going into this, Dennis was facing about 28 years behind bars, but the state was arguing for an exceptional sentence. They wanted more like 97 years based on a few factors. The first was the rapid recidivism. Dennis had been released from jail just 8 months before killing Carolyn. The second reason was that Carolyn was particularly vulnerable that night, being highly intoxicated and significantly smaller than Dennis. In fact, that's why he chose her. Her vulnerability was exploited by him. The third reason they thought he deserved a much longer sentence was the impact on Carolyn's family, many of whom spoke at the sentencing hearing. After her disappearance, her husband and daughter struggled to cope, and it took them years to dig out of the hole. The fourth reason given was that Dennis continued to keep the location of Carolyn's body a secret. The defense argued that he should just get the standard sentence, but the court disagreed. They resentenced Dennis Smith to 70 years behind bars. Mind you, his 99-year sentence for his sister's murder still stood, so he wouldn't be getting out of prison ever. His first chance at parole was over 120 years away. So while this wasn't officially a life without parole sentence, it certainly would function that way. With Dennis sent away for the rest of his life, the family also worked to change how Washington handled its parolees. And they did it in the way that gets the most attention. They went right for the bank account. They filed a civil suit against the state for how they supervised, or rather didn't supervise, Dennis Smith. While the family did not love to hear that a murderer got parole just 10 years into his sentence, free to kill again, procedure was followed up to that point. It was what the family learned happened after that worried them. The record showed major issues in how he was supervised, something that's shocking to see because he was on parole for murder. In 1992, when Dennis was paroled, the review board wrote that Dennis could not, under any circumstances, consume alcohol or drugs, or he would be a public safety risk. So you would think that that would mean he would be drug tested for the entirety of his parole. But he wasn't. After testing negative for 6 months, they stopped routine testing. When Dennis was released, he moved in with his wife in the Walla Walla area. If you remember, they married while he was behind bars and she was a church volunteer at the prison. After several months, she contacted Dennis's parole officer and said he needed to be tested for drugs. He had taken to staying out late and she saw signs that something wasn't right. However, the parole officer opted not to test him. Dennis then moved to the Vancouver area to live with his parents, which violated another condition of his parole. He was to have no contact with the victim's son, which was his nephew, Dustin. Dustin was living with his grandparents, so that means Dennis shouldn't have been living there. But he was, and either the parole officer never checked on his living situation to learn this, or it was ignored. For some reason, it took months for Dennis to be assigned a new parole officer in Vancouver after his move, which left him unsupervised at a time when his wife had recently said she suspected drug use. When Dennis got back on track with having a parole officer, he was spot drug tested, and he tested positive for meth. The parole board then ordered him back to jail for a few months, whereas his parole officer had actually suggested they send him back for more like 1 to 3 years. After Dennis was released again, his supervision was described by the Killaby's lawyer as spotty, in part because his parole officer was injured in July of 1995 and couldn't do any out-of-office visits for around 2 months. So that meant no checking on where he was living, who he was living with, where he was working, or where he was spending his time. They did not know that Dennis was staying out all night drinking, as well as, allegedly, dealing meth at Omar's, and they might have learned that if he was being checked up on. In September of 1995, his parole officer was transferred, and Dennis was not assigned a new one for a couple more months, meaning Dennis was again unsupervised leading up to Carolyn's murder. I am a big proponent of parole and giving people second chances, but there is a reason parole is supervised. It's saying, you deserve a second chance, but for public safety, we are going to keep an eye on you. The Killabys were saying that the state of Washington was not keeping that eye on Dennis Smith, and if they had, Carolyn Killaby would still be alive. Right before the civil trial was to start, the state and the Killabys came to a settlement agreement. And when I say right before, according to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, it was hours before opening statements that they agreed to settle, with the state paying the family $2.8 million. But the family still didn't have what they really wanted, and that was the location of Carolyn's remains. Over the years, Dennis would occasionally hint that he was going to give up the location of Carolyn's body. Around the time of his resentencing hearing, he said he had left Carolyn's body along a logging road on Larch Mountain, which is about 45 minutes from Vancouver. Searches of the area he indicated turned up nothing. Another time, Dennis offered to disclose the exact location of her body in exchange for Taco Bell burritos and $10,000 in cash. The state and the family opted not to negotiate with him. As for where it stands now, active searches for Carolyn's body slowed after Dennis Smith took his own life in November of 2004. According to the Columbian, he had recently been interviewed by police from Texas about an unsolved case, but I could not find what case it was or why people from Texas would be talking to Dennis Smith about it. After Dennis's death, Dan Killaby said that he felt relieved that they didn't have to think about Dennis anymore, but said he felt badly for Dennis's mother, who still believed he was innocent. One of the reasons Dennis's family was on his mind was that Dennis's nephew, Dustin, had become close to Carolyn's family in the aftermath of her disappearance and his uncle's arrest. Carolyn's mother started looking at him as another grandchild. They did not see him as the nephew of the person who killed Carolyn, but rather the son of another victim of Dennis Smith's. Though searches are not frequent, there is still hope that Carolyn's remains can be recovered. In the event you are someone who goes through Doe cases to match them with missing persons, Carolyn went missing in mid-November 1995 from the Vancouver area. Due to where Dennis Smith would have been able to drive in the time he was gone, Washington State and Oregon are likely locations. She had brown hair and was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. She did have a scar on her forearm, but no other identifying information like dental work or previously broken bones has been reported publicly. It is not known if Dennis Smith was telling the truth when he said he left her remains near Larch Mountain, but it is believed to likely be the truth, though Larch Mountain is a large area. Dennis Smith doesn't really seem like the type to have given details to other people, whether they were family, friends, or fellow inmates, but in the event he did and you know anything, you can call the Vancouver Police Tip Line at 360-487-7399, and the number will be in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.